Oh, that's right, for my constituency. Oh. I'm just welcoming the Lincolnshire contingent there. I'll just...
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what I believe is Onward's final panel event for Conservative Party Conference 2023. I am Shivani H. Menon, and I work across Onward's Levelling Up and Social Fabric programs. I can think of no better way to conclude our amazing lineup of events this conference than with a fascinating conversation on the future of tax reform. Effective tax governance is a fine balancing act. On one hand, we see that the tax burden on British citizens is the highest it's been in recent history, and this is despite successive governments promising tax cuts. And on the other hand, we see that fiscal sustainability sits at the very heart of good conservative governance, to the extent to which sound money was described as George Osborne to be the oldest conservative principle of all. Onward's own research has shown that tax is also not spatially blind. Very many important taxes like council tax and value-added tax are regionally regressive, and that's something I believe we will be discussing in greater detail today. And unpicking this complex landscape of tax reform is a stellar panel of experts from the world of policy and politics. To my right, I have Dr. Arun Advani, the Associate Professor for Economics at the University of Warwick, who has been recently appointed to the OBR in their advisory panel. Arun's research group, CAGE, at the University of Warwick is kindly supporting our event today. To his right, we have Victoria Atkins MP, who is a Financial Secretary to the Treasury. To my left, I have Danny Kruger MP, who is on the Treasury Select Committee that is currently investigating tax reliefs. And to his left, we have Tom Pope, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, whose recent work looks at how evidence should be deployed in designing tax policy. How this event will pan out is we will start off with opening remarks from each of the panelists for about 5 minutes or so, after which we will open to questions from the audience. Definitely do engage with us on social media. This event is being live streamed on YouTube, and our Twitter X handle is @UKOnward. Do use the hashtag CPC23 in any of the engagements you do. And that being said, let us start with the panel event. Minister Atkins, shall we start with you? What are your thoughts on the future of tax reform? What is the appetite in government for this at the moment? Let's kick off this event.
Well, thank you so much. And hello, Onward. It's a genuine pleasure to be here. I think Onward is one of the most forward-thinking and ambitious think tanks out of a wealth of think tanks that we have in Westminster at the moment. So it's a genuine pleasure to be here working with you on this important topic. Now, before I get into the meat of the subject matter, I thought it might help to just try and break down some of the mystery around my title and what it means in the Treasury, because the Treasury has great big thick walls and sometimes that impenetrability reaches, I think, also into the titles that we use for our ministers. So I am Financial Secretary to the Treasury. That means I am the minister responsible for the UK's tax system. I'm also the lead minister for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Although I am not allowed, indeed no FST is allowed, and rightly so, to intervene in individual tax cases. There are very, very strict rules about taxpayer confidentiality, which we absolutely respect and observe. Nonetheless, it is my job to work with the Chancellor to steer tax policy and to meet the priorities of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. I'm also in the position about 6 weeks out from the autumn statement, which is happening on November the 22nd, where I'm afraid I can't say very much on the future of tax policy, because I have had it drummed into me as a Treasury Minister that if I say anything at all exciting before a fiscal event, then that presents an opportunity for people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and for markets to react. So forgive me if I am incredibly dull and create no headlines this afternoon. Some of you who've seen me speak before may think that's part of the course, but I'm going to try and help in other ways. In terms of the tax system, I think we should genuinely be proud of our tax system and the history we have of its foundation. Having a safe and strong and stable and secure tax system is the foundation of our democracy, of the rule of law, and of our freedoms. And I say that having seen for myself the work that HMRC does internationally to help developing economies set up and establish their own tax systems so that their own democracies can flourish and thrive. Because without the taxes that pay for the services we care so deeply about, we also don't have the very structure of, for example, paying council tax to the council who will then run our elections for us and so on. So it's an absolute bedrock of a free and fair society. And although we may not enjoy paying tax, I think most of us recognise that it is part of our, if you like, silent social contract that we will do so. And so HMRC's job, obviously, is to collect the taxes that the government sets, and they are pretty good at it. Last year, we collected £814 billion in taxes, and we reported over the summer a tax gap of 4.8%. And for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, the tax gap is the difference between the tax that theoretically we should be able to collect, the tax that is liable or due to be collected, and the taxes that we actually manage to collect. And 4.8% is a very, very good standard, actually, internationally. We have many, many partners in equivalent sized economies who look on that figure with some jealousy. I don't know if that's putting it too strongly, but they're very keen to know how we achieve it. And so part of my job is to help HMRC not just collect those taxes, but to do so in a way that is fair to the taxpayer. When I was appointed by the Prime Minister a little under a year ago, I set 3 objectives for HMRC and the Treasury. Every single proposal that they put before me, I want it to be rinsed through 3 criteria. I want to know whether the proposal will make tax fairer. I want to know if the proposal will make tax simpler. And I want to know if the proposal will help achieve growth. And it is no secret to explain that sometimes I get proposals through my in-tray that perhaps meet one of those objectives, or perhaps meet one and then go against another of the objectives. And that's part of the responsibility I have as Minister to make those judgments. So, for example, we, in the last finance bill, raised the rate of corporation tax to 25%. That is a rate that I know many people had concerns about. I understand why they would have those concerns as a Conservative. But the reason for it is that it is part of the tough decisions we had to make following the enormous help we gave to the country as a whole during the pandemic. Some £400 billion of money was spent not just on the NHS, but also through schemes such as furlough and small business grant schemes, and all help out to eat out to help out, and so on. All of these things cost money, £400 billion worth, and we have to account for that at some stage. We also, of course, last winter helped families up and down the land with the cost of living pressures that arose as a result of Putin's illegal war in Russia. Again, that money has to be accounted for. And so at autumn statement last year, Jeremy, as Chancellor, had to make some very, very tough decisions, and corporation tax was one of those decisions. But so that's trying to make sure that we're looking at the macroeconomic impact of government spending, but we wanted to make it fairer, and so we put in a taper so that only the most profitable businesses would be eligible for that 25% rate. And in turn, we also said, if you are liable for that 25% rate, if you spend money on plant and machinery, if you invest in your productivity, then we will fully expense that for you. So we tried to, in our creation coordination of tax policy, even when we have very, very serious responsibilities when it comes to ensuring that we are focusing on sound money, as George Osborne and indeed Jeremy Hunt as Chancellors have both talked about. Nonetheless, we try to do so in a way that is fair and equitable. So through those three measures that I've said to the Treasury and HMRC, every single policy must flow. Those are the lenses that I'm applying to tax policy as FST. And as I say, very, very keen that I know that at some point we will get on to discussions about individual taxes and their impacts on communities and their fairness. I do apologise in advance if I'm not able to contribute as fully as I would like, but please do know that I will be listening very carefully to the thoughts and suggestions you have, and genuinely we are very much in listening mode whenever it comes to good ideas about tax.
Thank you so much, Minister, especially your three criteria of fairer, simpler, and will it achieve growth. I think these are three variables we can keep coming back to throughout this conversation. Could I come to you next, Arun? You've looked at a lot of the evidence on specific taxes. Now we know these three tests and criteria it has to meet. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, those criteria are really helpful to have kind of laid out, and I think they're exactly the right ones that we should all be kind of testing all taxes against. I think the first thing just to say, because I think it will probably come up in the later discussion, is we should separate out the question of how much we should tax and how we should tax. So there will be a question that may come up in the discussion of how much should the state do, how much money should we raise, and I don't have a particular view on that in the sense that that is, I think, not an academic question. That's not a question. I as an academic am not going to have a view on that. Anyone else should need to care about. My opinion is my opinion, and you all have your own opinions. But whatever we've decided about how much the state should do and how we're going to fund the state, we then have to decide what's the best way to raise that money. And I think these are exactly the criteria we want to use. I think there's kind of two cases that we could think about in areas that are obvious for reform. So one is the fact that we don't tax work fairly at the moment. We tax work a lot compared to how we tax wealth. If you currently are a landlord and you get rent, you pay income tax on that. If you go to work on minimum wage full time, you'll pay income tax, and you'll also pay national insurance contributions on that income that you're then paying to the landlord. Unsurprisingly, in a country where we want to build a situation where everyone potentially has access to the housing market and to be able to be homeowners, something that Margaret Thatcher really pointed out is the core of a property-owning democracy, it's very hard to do that if you have a world in which the people who are renting are paying a higher set of taxes. They're paying an additional tax that landlords aren't paying. So that is a problem in the way that we tax work versus wealth. Something like that also shows up in capital gains tax. That's something that Nigel Lawson solved, and it was undone by Gordon Brown. The solution that he had was it shouldn't be the case that we tax inflation. It doesn't make sense that you set up a business, invest something, and 10 years later, the business might not have been that successful. It might have improved in value, but a lot of the increase in value might just be because inflation's been high, as we've seen recently. And then suddenly, you're whacked with a great big tax because the change in the value is just inflation. Nigel Lawson said that's not reasonable. That doesn't make any sense. What you want to have is an allowance that takes inflation out of the tax base. You maybe want to say we take inflation out. You could even go further and say you have inflation out and some additional return allowance to kind of compensate people for the capital they put at risk, because that allowance is based on how much money did you put in at the start. But then having taken that out of the base, what Nigel Lawson said is we also don't want people to deliberately avoid taxes by moving from an organizational form where they work to setting up a business that's not really ever intended to be a big growing business, but is always intended just to be a different way to get paid and to get a lower tax rate. So what he said was we should equalize the tax rate between capital gains and income tax, but we should make sure there's an allowance so that people who are really genuinely putting capital at risk are getting an allowance against that, so they're not paying that higher rate. I think that was a great system. I think that ticks those boxes of it's fairer. It treats people equally, whether they get their money from capital gains or whether they get it from income, whatever form they have it in. It's certainly simpler because it removes all of the bureaucracy that HMRC currently has, trying to police that boundary, trying to work out, well, is this really capital gains or was that some kind of weird income? We don't have to have all these anti-avoidance rules if there's no difference. Then you just choose whatever organizational form you want. You choose to be self-employed if you want to be self-employed. You choose to be employed if you want to be employed. You can choose that, and you're not doing it based on taxes. And we don't need an army of civil servants trying to police that boundary. And it's absolutely good for growth because it takes out of the tax base the actual capital you put at risk. It makes it possible to invest that capital and have an allowance against it. But at the same time, it's not giving that benefit, that lower tax rate, to people who might not be actually investing actual cash. So I think that's another set of reforms that you could do. And then the final one, just as a kind of thinking about what do we want? We want that system where we tax work more fairly compared to wealth. We also want a system that's not full of reliefs that are ones that allow some people to benefit while other people don't. What we want completely is equality across people who have the same circumstances, or the same kinds of incomes, or the same kinds of wealth. We don't want to tax those things differently. That's not currently the situation with something like inheritance tax. The way we have inheritance tax, is rightly been coming up in discussions the whole summer because the structure of inheritance tax at the moment is not at all a fair one. The structure of inheritance tax at the moment is one in which you have a relatively high rate, it's 40% tax rate, with a reasonably high threshold, depending on how it ends up, could be up to £1 million that you get tax-free if you and your spouse, if you're married or civil partnered, have both your allowances and you own a property and you have kids that you can pass that property on to. But, for example, if you have that money but you chose to always invest in, not in your own home, you moved around a lot, but you keep your money in just regular shares, you don't get as much of an allowance. Or you don't have kids of your own, you're going to leave this to your nephew or your niece, suddenly you don't get the benefit of that residence allowance. If you currently run a business, you might got to the point of your life where you think, I kind of just want to step back from that business and get on with my life and retire and enjoy it. And instead, the current structure of the tax system says, no, hang on to that business. Hold on to it for dear life until you die. Because if you do that, it'll be tax-free when you hand it over. No capital gains tax, no inheritance tax. But if you sell it now, you're going to pay that capital gains tax on sale, and you'll pay inheritance tax when you pass it on at death. That's not good for the people who are doing it. They are happy in one sense they get the tax break, but they're stuck in a situation where they're not doing something that's overall sensible for them. They're doing something that overall isn't good for growth, because at the point that they're kind of done with the business and they kind of want to retire, it would be good for them to sell it to someone who wants to run that business. Maybe they want to hang on to it, that's fine. Some people will really want to work until the day they die, but some people won't. Some people will say, look, I've got to the point where I'd quite like to hand it on and move on with something. And the tax system should treat those people neutrally. It shouldn't encourage them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise like to do. And so a sensible set of reforms around inheritance tax would be to get rid of some of those reliefs that are currently there, but to use the money that would raise. So if you were to get rid of, or even just to cap, something like the relief that's for businesses, so that you had £500,000 per person, £1 million essentially for a couple, on top of the £1 million that you get in terms of the current nil rate bans. So you gave them that £1 million. You would raise just from that reform £1.1 billion. If you add that to a couple of other reforms around getting rid of the separate rate for residence properties, so you join that with everything else, you'd be able to raise the tax threshold from currently £325,000, you'd be able to raise it to £525,000. That's a big increase in that threshold before people are paying. So for a couple, you can pass on 1.05 million tax-free, more if you include a business. And that's taking the number of people paying that tax down from getting on towards 7% in the coming years, down to the standard average that we've had for a long time of below 4%. So those are reforms that, again, going through your boxes, it's fairer in that it's treating like people similarly, not encouraging them to hold particular things. It's simpler. We're not having to police, well, is that really a proper business, or is that a business that you've sort of created as a way of storing things? We're not having to police those things anymore because we're not giving a separate allowance depending on what the form is. And it's good for growth because, again, it's encouraging people to hang on to the business for as long as they want to work in it, and as long as they want to get on with it, they can get on with their lives and sell that business to somebody else. So I'll leave it there and hand over.
Thank you, Arun. Some very interesting recommendations put forward here, which positions me very well to now move on to Advani, who is, I know, as a part of the committee's work, looking into tax reliefs, and Arun touched on some of that right now. What are your thoughts and comments?
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and very inspired by all of that, Arun. Thank you. Really tremendous set of suggestions for the Minister. Really great, and so many of them I think would really resonate politically, which is important to some of us. So let me just try and quickly set the context for what I think should be our tax policy, which is the state of our economy and the overall sort of structural realities that we face as a country. Because a lot of these discussions can often be fairly tactical, but the fact is that in the course of this century, over the last 25 years, we have, through a combination of deliberate policy and just the trends of the times globally, developed an economy that's just built on cheapness, on cheap labour, cheap credit, cheap imports. And the result of that has been this productivity crisis that we're now struggling with, the stagnation of living standards, because we have failed as a country to invest in people and in technology and in machinery to drive more growth. And I think we need to think about the tax system in that context. It's no surprise that in consequence of this model, we have the highest taxes and the highest borrowing in anybody's memory, going back to the Second World War. And yes, we should acknowledge the recent crises that have driven up taxation and borrowing in the last few years, but the trend was very high before that. And the structural causes, the drivers for high taxes and high borrowing remain. So how do we use the tax system to address some of these structural challenges? It is about growth. It is about driving productivity improvements. One challenge, and something that we've been looking at closely on the Treasury Select Committee, is the incredible complexity of our system. And Victoria is absolutely right to be focusing on simplification, as all Treasury ministers have tried to do over the years. I actually welcome the abolition of the Office for Tax Simplification, because I think that it recognised that isn't a little, responsibility to be put in an office.
Absolutely.
It is the responsibility of the Treasury and of the revenue. So I think the government's right to recognise this as a cross-cutting priority. But we do need to now see the tax simplification which the government is committed to, and particularly the end of all, well, not of all, but an improvement in the cliff edges and the perverse incentives that well-meant but badly designed taxation is inducing. So how do we rise to these structural challenges in our economy through taxation? My first priority would be, as a local MP, and I think it is important to think about the foundational economy, the everyday economy of the high street and the market town and the suburbs, the places that people live and where most people work. So I think we need a proper review of local taxation. We need to think much harder about business rates and the impact they have on, not just on the high street, but on the shape of the local economy. I think it's wrong that many businesses are paying the same in business rates as they're paying in rent. We have that in my towns in Wiltshire. Absolutely punitive rates of taxation levied on taxable value rather than actually on the activity of the business, on how well the business is doing, what its turnover is, what its profits are, or even do what rent they're actually paying. So I think the whole way we calculate business rates is really harmful to local growth. Secondly, I mentioned cliff edges, and there's a number of those that we've looked at in the committee, and that a group of Conservative colleagues and I have been working on recently, and we published a paper this morning here proposing a set of reforms, of which well, I'll go through them quickly. The higher income child benefit charge is a direct punitive tax on single earner families. A family which has one earner earning over £50,000 a year is paying a far higher marginal tax rate than a family with two people earning less than the higher rate. They might be earning almost double. The family might be almost twice as rich in terms of income as the single earner family, but because of the cut-off, the threshold. The poorer family is taxed much more, and that's a family in which one parent is investing their time for free in the care of children or elderly parents, or looking after other dependent adults. So I think we need to support family and the household economy much more deliberately. The second proposal we have is around small businesses and the terrible threshold of the VAT threshold. Once you reach £85,000, you're suddenly liable for VAT. The result of that, of course, is that you have hundreds of thousands of businesses bunching below the VAT threshold, not growing, not taking on more staff, not taking on more work, literally not working as hard as they would like to and as they'd be able to. And, of course, the effect on employment, the loss, the opportunity cost in terms of loss of employment, but also just the loss of productive activity. We have a productivity crisis. We have inflation because too much money is chasing too few goods. And we have an opportunity to create more goods, to see more economic activity by raising that threshold, I think, quite significantly, to help more small businesses to grow. And then the last one is the IR35 reforms, which have driven down self-employment, driven a lot of self-employed people out of work, and we want to, I think, as a country and as a party, we should want to stimulate and encourage and incentivise people to set up businesses and act as sole traders and to take on the risk, as they are doing as sole traders, and we should be helping them through the tax system. And then lastly, just to finish, I think going beyond that, and the challenge of this topic is thinking about the taxation for the modern economy. I think as we see the evolution of the world of work, we see what the global economy is doing through technology. I do think as a party, as a movement, we need to be thinking seriously about what the taxation is appropriate when automation has removed so many, not just manual but clerical jobs, including the high-tech, the creative jobs that we think might be reserved only for human beings. In fact, the machines will be capable of. And I think we are rightly suspicious of universal basic income, of any scheme that appears to subsidise worklessness. But it might be appropriate to think, in the context of the simplification agenda, about the old conservative idea of a negative income tax, where people who are earning sufficiently are paying income tax, but people who are not have a negative income tax, have a benefit through the tax system. I'm not sure that is the right approach, but it has the virtue of simplicity, and it has the value of responding to this huge challenge that we are facing as a society, as a civilization, of how to support people in a world in which there are just going to be fewer jobs. There might be other sorts of jobs, but they're not the sort of jobs that are going to be remunerated in the way that most jobs are currently. There'll be work for people to do, but it's the responsibilities of caring for others, of being good citizens, of looking after your family and your neighbours. And we might be able to use the income tax system to support people to do that kind of work. Obviously, we're a long way from working all this out, and there are huge dangers and pitfalls in what I'm describing. But I think it does behove us to think creatively about what a workless world will look like for Conservatives.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Danny. I found what you said on how when national tax policy is set often has differential impacts locally, and I think that's something I would be very keen to come back to, and probably when we do questions. Tom, let's come to you. You've looked at a lot of the evidence on tax, what works, what doesn't, when government often follows the advice, and when it might sort of work in the other direction. What are your thoughts on some of the things that have been said? And it would be great to hear more about your work too.
Yeah, thanks, Shivani. And I agree with lots that's been said so far. I think it's welcome that Victoria is assessing each sort of new tax policy by is it fairer, is it simpler, is it pro-growth? But I think, frankly, any of us, if we looked at our system as a whole, we wouldn't conclude that it's completely fair, that it's as simple as it could be, or that it's promoting growth. Now, both Arun and Danny have laid out a series of ways in which it's inefficient. I think, the cliff edges that we have in the system. You can look at our income tax marginal rate structure, the jump up to 60% after 100,000, and no one could conclude that that's the simplest way we could do it or the best way that we could do it. That also generates lots of the bunching that Danny mentioned with VAT thresholds. And actually, it's not controversial to say that, really. I think there's actually a lot of agreement across academics, across policy people, and even lots of politicians who've thought carefully about this, about the types of reforms we should be looking at, the ways in which the system doesn't work well. The one that Arun mentioned on the different ways that we tax work is one. And we worry a lot about the fact that the tax burden is increasing. We often define the tax burden as the share of the economy taking in tax. Or a different way of thinking about the tax burden is actually how much is it discouraging economic activity, how much is it discouraging growth. And that isn't purely a matter of how much tax are we taking overall, but as Arun said, the way that we're taking it. And there are ways that you can tax more efficiently and less efficiently. The fact that we undertax some types of work means that we have to tax employees higher, and that's a bigger disincentive to work, to raise the same amount of tax overall. The fact that we have several arbitrary carve-outs in lots of taxes means that tax rates overall need to be higher. And that's a big challenge that, as I say, I think there's actually quite broad agreement on that. The problem is there's broad agreement on that, and yet, if anything, the system keeps getting more complex. Despite efforts, it doesn't get particularly fairer, and there aren't big strides being made to make it pro-growth. And that's because tax policy is a really difficult area to reform and to design well. And at the Institute for Government, we think a lot about the way that policy is made. And a few years ago, we looked at this question of how can you design tax reform better? We know that whenever you try and design a reform, so not just changing a rate up and down, but actually changing a relief or doing something a bit more complex with the structure of the system, that creates some losers and some winners. And we know that the losers always shout louder. So even if there's a reform that might be popular overall, it might be politically very difficult to implement. And I think, as a government that needs to think about how are we going to raise tax, whatever level of tax, more efficiently. And given growing demands on public services, the need to raise tax efficiently is more important than ever. I think the question is, how can we do that? And unfortunately, we thought about this. We didn't come up with some silver bullet solutions that are going to solve everything, but we do have some ideas. One is that there needs to be a much clearer strategy, sort of a whole of government strategy for what the tax system is trying to do. It would be great for Victoria's principles of fairness, simplicity and growth to be sort of set out and maybe elaborated upon a bit more in a document that sets out this is where we want the tax system to go. Now, there's so much of an incentive when every budget comes along for the Chancellor to pull a rabbit out of the hat that will make a headline, sometimes even one that will make a joke work in a budget speech, and then you're left with a more complex system after that. If you had a strategy that said, actually, this is where we're going, and the reforms that we're going, the changes that we're going to make to the tax system over this Parliament over the next few years are going to be consistent with these high-level principles. These are our objectives for the system. That would be a really good place to start. There's also more opportunity to do this at the start of Parliament. So I think, frankly, the next year is going to be quite a difficult time to make a really controversial set of tax reforms. But the start of the next Parliament could be a really good opportunity to set out your stall and say, this is how we want the system to change going forwards. Then I think on this question of what policies drive growth, there's a real opportunity to build the evidence base to be stronger so that the government can say more confidently, not just we think, we hope this policy will drive growth, but here's the evidence that maybe Arun and colleagues have developed that shows actually, yes, there's a pro-growth relationship here. And then finally, there's ways that politicians can be more strategic too, for example, through packaging reforms better. Many of you may remember when Philip Hammond tried to increase self-employed national insurance from 9% to 11%, still below what employees pay. And that was, he had to U-turn on that. There was a lot of opposition. Actually, just 1 year before, a change that George Osborne had implemented came into force that actually reduced the national insurance contributions for lots of self-employed people. But because the giveaway came first and then the takeaway came later, Philip Hammond tried to make the argument that actually this is a reform that's rebalancing how we pay tax, and actually some people are winning, some people are losing. The way it was presented was just there were a set of losers. So I think there are a whole load of ways that the government needs to be more strategic to try to identify first what it's really trying to do with the system, and then to build the groundwork, build the case for reform. And that's how lots of the types of changes that have already been discussed, that both Arun and Danny have mentioned, that's how we can actually deliver them when often it seems politically impossible.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Let us now open the floor to questions. If you could say your name, which organization you're from, and keep your question as short as possible, that'd be greatly appreciated. Can I get the lady at the front, on the left, and the person on the front here as well? Thank you. The mic's just coming to you, sorry.
I was very interested to hear what you said, Danny. I am a bookkeeper for small businesses, and every year I get people saying to me, keep an eye on my turnover. I don't want to go onto VAT because they are supplying people who aren't VAT registered. And it hasn't gone up with inflation. And as I said, I've got businesses every year that say that to me. And it should be higher. I really think it should be quite a bit higher. And the business would then get bigger.
That's right.
And then they'd pay more tax. And the government would get the money back, but in a different way. And that is what I came here to say.
Fantastic.
And to hear you saying that.
If only we had a Treasury Minister who was responsible for tax policy, who could hear you say that. Thank you very much.
I think I know the person,
Okay.
actually, the working pen. I know.
Thank you.
My
Thank you so much for your question. Can we get the next question as well, and then we'll do answers?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been in business myself, and
Sorry, your name, please.
I'm Tony Bly. I'm from Southwest Wiltshire. I'd like somebody to explain to me why corporation tax is a good idea. Now, I'm all in favour of tax. It's a wonderful thing. If you spend money, you're tax VAT. If you receive dividends from a company, you pay tax. If you receive a bonus or a salary, you pay tax. And that's all fine and dandy. But corporation tax is a tax on money that is in a corporation. It's not going into somebody's pocket. So I used to run a business that was a negative cash flow. So the more business we did, the more cash we needed for stock. So we paid corporation tax, and we had to go and borrow the money to then, keep up our stock levels and whatever. You've also got a huge distortion of what companies do because they need to go to their account. It's fantastic, a lot of work for creative accountants to get around corporation tax, a lot of creative accountancy going on. Businesses change what they do to avoid corporation tax. You've also got a huge advantage for international businesses because they can move profits around the globe. They can make their profits appear to come from a low tax regime.
Because I think the minister has to leave soon. Could I ask for the question?
Yeah, I want.
Why is corporation tax a good idea?
Yeah, why not just get rid of corporation tax altogether and just be done with it?
Right.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I'll start off with you, Minister.
If I may, I'll deal with them both. So the VAT threshold question is one that we hear very great often, and believe you me, we look at it very carefully. It's interesting. So VAT is our third most profitable, if you like, tax, as in it's the third third highest tax that we raise as a government. It's something like £160 billion, so that's an enormous amount of UK PLC. And the threshold that we set at, £85,000, is actually still the highest in the EU, and it's, I think, the second highest in the OECD. So to comparable nations, it's still higher. Interestingly, I get lobbied by people who'd like it go up. I also get lobbied by people who like it to go down, because they say if you set it at a lower level, let's say £20,000 has been mentioned to me, then it's a level playing field for everyone. And of course, my response as a Treasury Minister is to say, crikey, we're trying to halve inflation, and I do not want to increase people's the cost of living pressures on people by 20% for those businesses that are not eligible yet to pay VAT or not liable to pay VAT. Interestingly, at that level, the majority of UK businesses are out of VAT. They do not meet that threshold. But of those businesses that do have to register for VAT, half of them, that do register, half of them, in fact, do so voluntarily. So they take the business decision to register. And we've also looked at the threshold of 85k, and I can't remember the figures precisely, forgive me, but there is not quite the bunching that we see. It may be anecdotally you feel that as a bookkeeper, but I have to look at the UK economy as a whole, and it's not quite as significant as perhaps one would feel it if you were having people wanting it to happen, wanting to avoid it. So we do keep it under review, of course we do, but that's just some of the thinking that goes into it. On the corporation tax, the reason that we tax corporations is because we believe they are a fundamental part of our economy. Again, it's a major tax for the UK to collect. I am very, very happy to ask the likes of Facebook and Tesco and other massive corporations to pay their bit to help us pay for the NHS, pay for roads, pay for the police, pay for defence. And so I think that is a tax that is here to stay. I do understand your point about international headquartering, these multinational companies moving their headquarters around the world to try and avoid paying tax. That's why the Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor, negotiated with OECD countries to introduce what's called Pillar 2. And we've just brought it in the latest finance bill. That means that in the OECD countries that have signed up to it, all of these multinational entities will pay a floor of 15% corporation tax. For us, that's good news because we have never had a 15% corporation tax. It's always been above that. But for those jurisdictions that thus far have relied on a low rate of corporation tax to attract businesses to their economy, they are going to have to top up their tax in order to meet that floor of 15%. So in the medium term, I think actually it's going to be quite a big equaliser across the world economy. But as I say, that's because the Prime Minister has absolutely understood the concerns people have, particularly about these huge digital tech companies that perhaps have not necessarily headquartered where their sales are.
Thank you for that. Danny, did you want to chime in on the small businesses and VAT point?
Well, it's interesting to hear the Treasury analysis is that there is not as much bunching as others suggest and detect, and I defer to Victoria on that. It's very interesting. I'd be interested to see it because the impression that I get and the research I've seen is that it is a real problem. I think, and I understand the argument. It's one obviously don't agree with, but the value of bringing down the threshold to equalise it and to bring everybody in would be fine. As the current threshold might be fine if it was simpler to register. I mean, the burdens involved. I mean, that's the challenge. And the idea that with the highest in the OECD, well, other countries' systems of sales tax or VAT is a lot simpler than ours. So I think there is still a simplification argument. But anyway, I still think we should raise it. And lastly, Victoria, I'm concerned about this idea of a global floor for corporation tax, because although I recognise the argument, it's to catch out these very footloose multinationals. Ultimately, 15% isn't an unrealistic aspiration, I think, for the UK. In fact, our current Chancellor pledged to do that when he was running for the leadership. So I think the idea that 15% is unreasonable for the UK, well, maybe it shouldn't be. One day we could try and get there. And my concern is that we've now set a floor globally. You know what happens to these global floors, they rise. So
just to reassure on that point, there is a single country veto on that. We were very, very careful, the UK, in negotiating this so that if ever anyone tried to propose that, we, the UK, would have the right to veto it. So, but would you excuse me? I'm so sorry, I've got to go to the next thing, but thank you very much indeed for hosting me.
Thank you. Before I hop on to further questions from the audience, I want to abuse my position as chair and ask a question myself, and that we briefly touched on this right now, which is where we stand internationally. Is our tax burden very high when we look at it at an OECD-wide level? I thought I might get Arun and Tom to pitch in on this. Let's start with you, Tom.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the statistics overall, total amount of tax as a share of the economy, which I've just said is not how you should think about the tax burden, but is the easiest way to compare internationally, we're about middling, is the way of thinking about it. I mean, you need to be a bit careful about what's being measured in that. In lots of countries in Western Europe in particular, there are social security contributions that are thrown in there as well, which you might think, well, we have national insurance contributions, but they work very differently. Our national insurance contributions are really just a tax because the amount you put in doesn't really affect how much you get out. Social security contributions in Western Europe are, more genuinely contributory. So it's more like the way that we contribute to a private pension, at least to some extent. But there are other ways I think it's interesting to think about how we compare in terms of the simplicity question. And our tax base. You look at our VAT system; it is much more complicated. The number of different zero ratings and exemptions that we have is much larger than any other country. Again, this gets back to the losers problem, because as soon as I start to list all the extra ones that we have that other countries have, you're all going to stand up and say, no, don't get rid of that one, because we all quite like zero rates, don't we? But that's one example of where we're quite complex. And then I suppose the other way of thinking about it is what are our top tax rates and how much are we taxing the kind of very high income. And again, we're sort of middling to low on that. I did some work back when I was at the IFS a few years ago, looking at how does the tax burden in the UK compare to other countries, sort of at different income levels. And actually, we're relatively high at a sort of middle income level and somewhat less high when you look right at the top.
Thank you so much, Tom. Let's come to you on this as well, Arun.
Not a lot to add. I think Tom was pretty comprehensive on the different ways to think about it. So I think better to get more questions.
Okay, let's get more questions. Could we have the lady at the very back, please, and the gentleman at the front? Let's start there and then come here.
Yeah, I would just like to ask the wider panel their views on capital gains tax. So I think it's a policy that has a lot of sort of, consensus behind it. Arun put forward some of the arguments for it. And it's also really a very conservative policy, Nigel Lawson. So I just like the panel's views on capital gains tax equalisation.
Could we get your name and organisation, please?
Oh, yeah, of course, sorry. It's Rachel Henry from Tax Justice UK.
Thank you so much, Rachel. In the front.
Hi there, Francois from Onward. Quick question about Brexit. There was many conversations back in the day about Singapore on Thames. I think it's fair to say we are not here. But what are some of the opportunities that were opened by Brexit and which have been taken so far?
Thank you for the questions. On capital gains tax, let's come to you, Arun, and then we'll move around between the panelists for the rest of the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said on capital gains, personally, I think a completely conservative, rational system is exactly what Nigel Lawson introduced, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, whatever it is, no, 35 years ago, when he equalised the tax rate between capital gains and income tax, but said there should absolutely be an allowance for the investments you're making, and so you had an allowance that specifically took the amount you put in plus an allowance that comes up from inflation. So you could go a bit further than just inflation if you wanted to. I think you definitely want a system that looks much more like that than this system that we sort of inherited from Alistair Darling, where they sort of flattened out the rate, didn't have it very related to what your income tax rate is, and that obviously leads to avoidance behaviours that are kind of well known when you talk to any practitioners. That it leads to people switching between forms. It doesn't help growth because it discourages people from potentially working for somebody else where that might be the more productive thing to do because they're facing that higher tax rate they get there than they get setting up their own business, even where it's not a business that they're trying to grow. Clearly, there are businesses where you put real capital at risk, and Lawson wanted to have an allowance for that. We should have that. But we don't need something where no one's putting anything at risk.
Danny, does capital gains tax make its way into any of the inquiries you're conducting at the moment?
I don't think so in the Treasury, but Select Committee. But I think, I feel that's a very powerful argument, and I think the point about not taxing inflation is a really sound one. I mean, there is probably a case for taxing capital. I mean, I think the recognition is growing, including on our side of politics, that the disparity in wealth is the most significant inequality that we face economically rather than in income. And actually, but if we want to tax capital, we should just do it directly through some kind of wealth tax rather than taxing the growth in capital, which, as you said, is just growth in which is just unearned and inflationary. So I think the case for equalisation is strong. On the Brexit opportunity, I mean, VAT is the great one. I mean, Vote Leave promised it, I think. It was part of the pledge to the people that we would be able to take back control of VAT in the way that we couldn't in the EU. And I regret we haven't yet really exploited that opportunity.
Great. Yeah, I mean, on Brexit, just when I said that we don't want to have lots of zero rates in VAT, the EU was stopping us adding even more, and now we could do that if we wanted to. I'm not sure that's actually great tax policy. It is an opportunity. The other area that we have more freedom from Brexit is tariff policy, and actually I think that's an area that, in the tax debate, we haven't really had that conversation of what we want to achieve through our tariff policy. We do have a slightly different set of tariffs set out, but I don't think we've actually had that conversation properly yet. On capital gains, would agree with what Arun and Danny have said. I think it's a good example of where we just need. There isn't a really clear narrative of what the tax is trying to achieve. It's often treated in quite a bitty way, and you have very specific examples. And I think a government that was really courageous and got out ahead of this and made the positive case, I think would have good success. Actually, because I didn't answer the why corporation tax question earlier, and there are a few reasons why we have corporation tax that range from sort of more kind of moral arguments, or the idea that, well, not moral, but it's kind of quid pro quo arguments, the idea that actually businesses benefit from lots of public spending, like the fact that we maintain our road network and so on, and without that, businesses wouldn't be profitable. But then there are more practical reasons as well. For example, that it's a backstop to other taxes, that it stops. If you didn't have corporation tax, it would be easier to sort of take money out of the country. And one way in which that happens, you mentioned, so I completely agree with the principle that ultimately taxes are paid by people and not by corporations. Actually, lots of the people being taxed by corporation tax are foreign shareholders. And governments are not too keen to give up their right to tax foreign shareholders that they don't otherwise have. To get even more practical, we raised £50 billion from corporation tax, and I'm not sure governments are ready to make the case for another £50 billion to raise elsewhere.
Thank you so much. Let's take some more questions from the audience. Could we get the man at the very back and the person in the front, please?
It's on. Hello. So one way in which the UK tax system is a bit of an international outlier is the fact that we have very little recognition for families and children compared to a lot of other developed nations in Western Europe, but even the United States, where couples can file together. In Germany, a couple with children don't start paying income tax until they make €52,000 per year between them as a household, regardless of who works and who and how much and who delivers care responsibilities. And so therefore, couples have more choice in that sense, and one choice is not tax penalised over the other. I appreciate the pushback that to increase greater recognition for families is not necessarily the most progressive way of giving tax allowances, and that's kind of very kind of standard Treasury counter-argument that you often hear. And you also do hear the argument that it's sort of in some way kind of morally problematic because it's nudging in one direction rather than the other. I would suggest that the positive externalities from having more children is more than compensate for these sort of counter-arguments, particularly given our demographic challenges. Obviously, it would cost money. Is there a case for greater recognition for families in the tax code?
Thank you for your question. And the person in the front, please.
Sorry, I thought.
Right here.
Thank you. Sienna Gold, I'm here as a party member, but in my day job I'm a tax partner. I'm interested as a Conservative who favours low tax, but also rights and responsibilities. Why so much is framed as benefits and subsidies when it could instead be a tax cut? And in fact, this links exactly onto your point in that Rishi's childcare reforms next year are better than a tax cut for me, but it could have been framed as you pay for childcare out of pre-tax profit, pre-tax income, and then we would have had a narrative going into the next election that there is lower tax. Likewise, if we talk about cutting inheritance tax, could we do it in a way that you get a lower inheritance tax rate if you're paying towards social care or end-of-life payment? Or landlords, you get a lower income tax rate if you are renting out to benefits claimants or families on a 7-year tenure. It seems that so much. Is this because of a policy, because of the way government is organised and it's too difficult to join up two departments? Or is this just a terminology that we've got a bit twisted?
Thank you for your questions. I think I might come to Danny on the role of families in tax policy, and to Arun on the question of whether we should be framing these subsidies and reliefs that we offer in cuts and sort of the inheritance tax example that was used. Danny, after you.
Thanks. Well, I mean, Gavin knows I'm in agreement with him, and I think you put it well there. The fact is there is huge social benefit and ultimately economic benefit if we insist on counting it, and we can, in family stability and family growth, family formation. And the fact is family breakdown is generally a consequence of poverty. It's the primary driver of family breakdown. So how can we put more money into families, into households? Well, to your point, the tax system is better than benefits, and we could be being very deliberate about recognising the value of the unpaid care that people give to each other, to their children, and to their elderly parents. And I would be using the benefit system and structured however we decide, because I agree that we could do a lot better. In fact, through some of the mutual insurance models that Tom mentioned, in terms of the way other countries do these things, to use the subsidies that we give through to childcare and social care to reinforce the household economy, to reinforce the choices that most people want to make, which is to, particularly in their children's very early years, to look after them at home or close to home in more informal settings, and to look after their elderly parents either in their own homes or come to live with you, or to have, again, an informal model of care rather than only getting taxpayers' support if you're putting your elderly parent into a residential care home. So I think we could be much more deliberate, and I think the value to the Exchequer will follow, because family breakdown, the consequences of low family formation is critical right now in terms of its impact on our housing economy and on welfare and on a whole bunch of other government budget lines, and it's a future demographic disaster. So I think we should be very deliberate. And you're right, you can't be neutral, or you implied it, Gavin. The government is going to nudge us one way or the other. Its current incentives disincentivise family formation by treating everybody as an unconnected individual. And this was the great, I've mentioned Nigel Lawson. He intended to ensure that couples were supported and able to transfer their allowance when he introduced individual taxation. The corollary was going to be transferable allowances, and that didn't quite happen.
Just on to you.
Yeah, just actually building on Danny's point. So, particularly given that you raised the point a bit earlier about the high income benefit charge, I think one point we didn't raise is the further charge that comes at £100,000. Not only is Tom's point that the marginal tax rate rises at £100,000 from 40% to 60%, but also you lose access to free childcare. And so, if you have a couple of kids who are young and you would have been getting free childcare hours, you'd actually lose all of those hours as well. And so the tax rate can be close to 100, or even over, if you have enough children, over 100%. So it really is hugely costly in the distortions we're creating. So it's not only we're not currently recognising anything to do with the children system, we actually are recognising it, but in a very negative way. We're just going to give you a really big charge when you hit particular thresholds, and that's certainly not what we should be doing. On the point of framing, I'll defer to Danny on how politicians should frame things as the politician. I think on some of the specific examples that you used, I think it would be fair to say I don't think they would meet Victoria's test of kind of simplicity, because if you start saying, okay, we're going to have rent, but it depends on who you're renting to, one, you need the state to have a lot more information on who all of the relationships that are going on. The state needs to not only know that I'm a landlord, but what property I'm a landlord of and who I'm renting to, and the kind of conditions for that person for us to figure that out. I also need to know much more about their situation in some cases than I need to know now. So it's certainly not simple, and it may also require quite a lot more intrusion than we currently have. So I'm not sure I would necessarily be on board with all of those specific suggestions, but the framings question I think is really one that is much more aimed at Danny, I think.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for maybe a last round of quick questions, if anybody has some. Person at the back.
Famously, when the Cameron government cut the top rate of tax from 50 to 45%, they saw a revenue increase from that tax band. This is broadly at the panel, do you think you'd see a similar effect further down the tax system, from 20%, 15% instead of 40 and so on? And when you're, the economists in the room, when you're modelling the economy and the tax system, do you ever treat student finance as an extra tax band?
Well, two questions in there. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I think we're just going to entertain that one question. Sorry, sir. Let's start with you, Tom, on that. The 2010 policy and what that means today for lower income bands, and the question on student finance.
Sure. So I think the evidence is pretty clear, although Arun will know it better than me, that we know people at the top of the income distribution have a lot more different ways that they can respond to a tax change. So actually lots of the reason why that 50 to 45p change didn't cost very much was not necessarily that people were working harder, but that they were trying a bit less hard to avoid income tax, for example, by incorporating, setting up a company and having dividends instead. Those are the kinds of opportunities that operate a lot more at the top of the income distribution than those towards the bottom. So I think we should expect there to be less of a behavioural effect in terms of people changing their decisions at lower income tax bands in general. And on student loans, yes, increasingly it should be thought of as an extra marginal tax, because most people, certainly those on the £9,000 fees, are not going to repay the money. So it's different from a tax if people know they're going to pay it off eventually. As soon as they know they're not going to pay it off eventually, it's just a tax that lasts for 30 years from graduation.
Thank you. Arun, did you want to come in?
No, agree with what Tom said. I think just given that we're in sort of wrap-up mode, I guess I should say, given that we're in wrap-up mode, I think I should say, in terms of the big picture of where we are in terms of thinking out the tax system, as we said at the start, there's different things we could think about the amount we should be raising, but looking at Vicky's fantastic set of here are the 3 goals you should have for the tax system, we absolutely are not there, and we're not close to there. And there are plenty of reforms that actually I think it sounds like everyone's agreeing on in terms of what we should be doing. There's lots of things we can disagree on, and there will be lots of time for disagreement. But the sort of sad or good thing is there's lots to agree on, and yet we're not doing it. And I think the pressure is then to try to get politicians, be that Vicky, be that whoever else is, in a year's time, whether it's her in that post or whether she's been promoted and we've got a new FST. We need to make sure there's pressure for those sensible reforms to happen that are the things that would actually make the tax system fairer, better for growth, and simpler.
Thank you. Well, in a single line summary, I think what we've learned from today's panel is when we do tax, there are a lot of unintended consequences, and tax design and policy needs to better factor that in. Thank you all for your thoughts and your remarks. The panelists were fantastic, so can we join our hands together for a round of applause for them? Thank you. Thank you specifically to Cage for kindly sponsoring this event, and to our audience for being so engaging, both physically and our online audience as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Well done. Very good.